So as I said before, I'm Marjorie Krause. I'm the founder and executive chairman of APCO Worldwide, and we're very happy to bring you this session today, bringing everybody up to date on what is happening on the coronavirus and how it impacts Saudi Arabia, and then to talk a little bit about what's next, because we have panels from around the world who are at various stages of dealing with the coronavirus. And I think it'll be very interesting to see kind of what their experience has been and how it relates to what your experience is on a day-to-day basis. We're going to talk first about some research that is brand new, that hasn't been, it'll be released right now, that was put in the field in Saudi Arabia on last Wednesday and came out on Friday. And then we're going to have some comments from the region. And then we will talk to one of the leading epidemiologists in Saudi about those results and about what Saudi is doing. We'll go from there to talk to somebody who's been involved in this crisis with business almost since the beginning in China and then elsewhere. And from that, we will go to somebody, our chairman for China, who has been involved in the China situation, and we'll see what lessons we can learn from China. And then we'll talk to a leading futurist about what's ahead and how all this will change the world. So we're in for, I think, a very interesting hour. So not to take any more time away from our discussion, I'm going to turn this over to Chris Levy, who is the head of APCO Insight in Europe and who fielded the study. And Chris, why don't you walk us through the research? And then Mamoun Spath, who is the president of APCO in the MENA region. I'm going to ask Mamoun to comment on the results that Chris has presented. Chris?
Thanks, Marjorie. And just to emphasize, as you mentioned, this is very fresh polling. It's come out of the field this weekend. Good sample of 500 respondents, all Saudi citizens, and a broadly representative spread as well. So there should be a good basis for some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Some results to show you around the economy, transformation, and how that could continue, public health, and also finally on Saudi and what this could all mean for the country's place in the world. These questions are very much forward-looking as opposed to the current response. So again, should tee us up nicely. We move on to the first slide, looking first of all at the economy. So we asked respondents not only how their household spending had been impacted by the crisis, but also how they foresaw that bouncing back afterwards. And really what we see is that spending is holding up very well. You have actually 4 in 10 saying that they are purchasing more since the crisis has begun. Even amongst the similar figure 4 in 10 who are saying they're purchasing less, we can then look on the right-hand side of the slide and see what they're saying they think might happen after things getting back to normal. So there you're seeing, yeah, again, decent number 4 in 10 saying that they anticipate immediately returning to normal. However, a note of caution is that there are quite a large number, again, a similar proportion, who are saying they're going to want to wait, re-establish that things are genuinely back to normal before their spending bounces back. So there's some discussion on post-recovery spending to be had for sure.
If I may add to this, this is Mamoun. This is clearly saying that people are still spending and they're still confident to continue spending. Now, this comes at a time the crisis hasn't yet impacted people's jobs as much as it did in the West. So hopefully we will not see more people stopping spending. That 40% could increase. But if anything, this is reflective of people's confidence in the economy and they're still spending. And a clear point that those people who are stopping spending or reducing spending, it will take them a while to recover. So from an economic perspective, this means the recovery will take time.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, confidence is definitely the word at the moment. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that this is, if we just move on, we can see
Chris,
that
as we
this,
move on, one question that came in is, will this be published afterward, and can people get copies of the recording? And yes, we will get you the copy of the recording, and you will have copies of the slides. So if you're trying to jot things down, you don't have to.
exactly. Thanks, Marjorie. So here we can see part of the reason for that confidence that we saw in the first slide, which is a strong feeling that economic changes of recent years have made the country more robust, better place to recover than it would otherwise have been. And this is not just on an absolute basis, but also if you look at things relative to other economies in the region, there's a strong feeling there among Saudi citizens that the country is again better set up than others to recover.
I mean, this is actually a slide that, for me as a communicator, is a key headline. If anything, this says that the vast majority, or at least 76% of Saudis, are fully supportive of the vision. So fully supportive of the program, the investment program, the economic program that has been put in place over the past 2 to 3 years. And not only that they believe in it, they also believe because of it, they will recover faster, the economy will recover faster than any other economy. So this is a vote of confidence in the vision.
Yeah, very strong vote of confidence. If we move on to the next slide, so our polling went into field just after the stimulus measures had been introduced in Saudi. And we set up these two different points of views. One, on the other hand, the sort of recognition that this is, on the left-hand side, the best way to support individuals. On the right-hand side, more of an expectation that other measures could be done to help the individual as well. As you can see, results there fell exactly down the middle, 45% split both ways. Mamoon, I'm sure you've got lots to add on this.
This is about the stimulus programs and the packages that have been communicated in different ways to the public. I think if anything we need to learn from, and the opportunity here is very clear to us, given that we see the same trend in the rest of the countries in the region. People are not yet fully understanding the stimulus program. What does it really mean? Does it affect their businesses? And how does it affect them personally, so whether directly or indirectly? So the opportunity here for government and for the private sector to cooperate, to shed more light on the nature of the stimulus program and how it affects people. That's my takeaway from this slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add a bit of a UK perspective, certainly there's a tendency of governments to focus on the headline figure, how much is being injected, but perhaps not necessarily to explain how that translates to the individual. It's certainly something we've seen here and elsewhere. Move on to the next slide. So thinking a little bit more about transformation in a broader sense than purely the economy. This question was on urbanization and whether the crisis should be seen as a sign to slow the pace down after things have recovered. And again, we can see that actually there are only a majority, not a insignificant minority, around 3 in 10, who agreed with that idea. However, a higher proportion, considerably higher proportion, in fact, are saying that we should not be slowing down the pace of urban growth in these very important projects, but rather we should be investing more, make sure we're as prepared as we can be to deal with any future potential crises of a similar nature.
So Chris, before Mamoon comments, there was a question about the sample size and the nature of the sample, whether it was business owners, individuals, whether it was broad-based, etc.
It's Saudi citizens, 500 Saudi citizens. And it's
a representative sample from across Saudi.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. So we can also break things down by age, gender as well, if you want to get into some discussion there. But very important to emphasize, this isn't a business sample.
If anything, this is another validation of the vision. I think people believe, the vast majority, well, I would say at least half or more, believe that we should continue investing. The train has left the station And people don't want this trend to stop at this stage. They don't feel that it should. So again, this is another vote of confidence in the vision.
Yeah, and I would definitely build on that, Mamoon. The next slide, which I think shows a similar perspective, more from a sort of culture point of view. So here, we posited the question, would you be concerned about the long-term negative impact of restrictions on each of the following? So again, just to stress that this is long-term, so we're asking people, do they think there will be problems after things are starting to return to normal? And actually the figure there that I would focus on is that at the bottom. So the 20%, which again is not insignificant, but is a definite minority of those who said that they would not have any concern if there were going to be long-term negative impacts on each of the items that you see there. So sometimes it's not, do you think there will be negative impacts? Rather, would you be concerned about? So what that shows is that a large majority of the population would be concerned if there were long-term damage towards the transformation in the cultural sphere. Mamoon.
And you can see that the concern is about the new gains, the new aspects of the economy that has been developing in Saudi Arabia. So people care for it and they want it to continue. So therefore, you could see that people have their eyes on those sectors where they've seen some serious growth.
Exactly. Thanks. If we move on to the next slide. This was more from a public health perspective, which I know we have to talk about more in the commentary that comes after this. Here we asked how people's behavior, how they foresaw that changing or not after the crisis. So not just have you changed your behavior in terms of cleaning and hygiene since the crisis started, but also what do you think you're going to do either once life looks to be getting back to normal, and even when there appears to be a vaccine that's ready as well. Here you can see that around a quarter of the sample foresee that they will be making permanent changes, more attention towards hand washing, other hygiene measures, etc. However, that is somewhat dwarfed by those who see it as more a temporary measure. They have adapted at the moment, but they foresee this continuing either only until things are back to normal or until that vaccine is in place. So one for a lot of discussion a little bit later. Move to our final topic. Here we wanted to take a broader perspective and to look at opinion on Saudi's place in the region when it comes to recovery efforts and also globally. So here we can see that over half of Saudis believe that recovery efforts should not just be focused inwards on the country's own economy and social recovery, but also rather going beyond that and focusing on the region, whether that is those who the country is more traditionally friendly with, or even you have 1 in 5 who are saying they should even go beyond and extend to helping those who are not the country's traditional allies.
If I may add to this, if anything, you know, a lot of countries, and you could see a lot of political rhetoric happens in the West and different places that we should go inwards, we should focus on our country, and even there are calls not to help other countries by some leaders. In Saudi Arabia, we see the population being a lot more generous in the sense that they want to be part of a global world. More so, they want to be part of a regional world and support that. Although we still have to look at this 1/3 that they believe that we should focus on our own. However, this is, in my view, is quite an impressive sample of people who want to help and want to be part of a global economy.
Exactly, and that internationalist mindset, I think, is something we see. The final slide I would like to show you, which is from that global perspective. So again, we set up these slightly different points of view. One, again, on the right-hand side, that countries should focus predominantly on their own economies. And then the other on the left-hand side, that this is a global crisis that requires a global response. And not just that, but that Saudi in particular has a convening role to play. Here you can see that results are a little bit closer to a split, but still slightly tending more towards that internationalist mindset. And of course, this question was posed very much with Saudi's presidency of the G20 in mind, and certainly this discussion we can have later in this session about the opportunities that that might present. Mamoon, any final comments?
Sorry, I'm unmuted. Yes, I mean, let me just conclude by saying in this part of the world, and this is for people who are not from this region, more than anywhere else I have lived in, especially in the Gulf, people are very much supportive of their leaders. So people believe in hierarchy and they listen to their leadership, and they tend to believe them more than anywhere else that I've had lived in. So by large, the governments have been delivering on promises. And so if the leadership, if the government is optimistic, the people are optimistic and they follow suit. And this puts, in my view, an unprecedented responsibility on governments, not only to provide constant, transparent flow of information, but also simple, something that they can understand and people can digest. So I think this is very unique. Maybe others on the call could comment whether they see anything different.
Thanks,
so we've been getting a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to weave them into some of the other comments, because some of them are forward-looking about whether this extends to other places and where we go from here. So I'll wait to bring those in to the other speakers. But the one that was relating to this was whether you thought what happened, what your responses were in Saudi extended to the rest of the region, and particularly Iran and Israel were mentioned, as whether you had any point of view on that. And I would just throw in that our experience in working with people around the world on this is that Saudi is definitely at the front end of positivity and response in terms of what is happening. That a lot of I'm not sure that the same results would happen in other places, but I'm going to challenge the other panelists to also speak to that. So I don't know if you have any quick response to that before we move on, about whether you think this extends to the rest of those two countries or the rest of the region. Mamoon or Chris?
I can add, yes. If I may, let's be clear. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and most of the Gulf countries did not hesitate for a second. So what happened when this crisis started evolving, they actually responded. I was in Dammam a few weeks ago, and I found myself locked out, and I needed to get out to get back home. So the reaction was fast and swift. Although some of us saw it as extreme at the time, today I'm extremely grateful. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the region here in the Gulf, I'm not talking about Iran, did not get involved into conspiracy theories and questioning whether this is real or not, and let's spend more time dwelling about it or have a political gain out of it. I think that's unique, and that's unique in some countries, not everywhere, not only the Gulf. Those countries who got involved in politics, in my view, are the ones who are paying the price right now, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on, and we're very fortunate to have Yasmin Al-Wadi with us, who's the senior scientist and the head of epidemiology for King Faisal Specialty Hospital and Research Center, and is quite well known around the world for her work. And I wondered, Yasmin, if you want to comment, especially on the health side of this, and share your thoughts with us.
If you can go back to that slide, I'd appreciate that, just so that I can have it in front of me, please. When I saw this slide, I was not that surprised, because I think a lot of people still believe that this is a temporary issue and that they can go back to normal, their normal behaviors, their normal activities after the epidemic is gone. But when it comes to something like hand hygiene, this is a big problem that is being faced by even hospitals. Go to any major hospital in the world. In the past, not just during the pandemic, but in the past, any hospital in the world will have major awareness campaigns trying to make sure that even doctors are going to comply or to remember to wash their hands. So this is an issue that obviously means we need to come up with new measures or stronger measures, or maybe communication needs to change in order to let the average person on the street, young people, everyone, it may be even starting in schools, to start developing these daily habits early on.
Do you have any other general observations about what is happening right now in Saudi and how Saudi has handled this from a health perspective?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As Mr. Ma'moon already mentioned, the Saudi government has, similar to several other governments, began very, very strict measures from the beginning, whether it was social distancing, stopping schools, no more prayers in mosques, quarantines of travelers, closing borders, closing even borders between administrative areas. We in Saudis cannot travel from one city to another anymore. I'm stuck in Riyadh. I cannot go see my family for another, I think, 2 weeks. So in addition to airplane travel and domestic travel on airplanes and whatever, all of these measures have been, we've been very, very lucky to have implemented at a very early stage at the epidemic curve, which I think helped in flattening the curve. But these, let me go back a little bit. One of the reasons I was really pleased to see the results of your opinion polls is because as a public health researcher and an epidemiologist, I understand opinion polls are a great tool to measure the collective beliefs and sentiments of the population. And because when it comes to healthcare, even though we can put as many measures and rules and regulations by health policymakers, in the end, what matters is how the people behave on a day-to-day basis. So understanding their opinions will lead to us making sure that we're sending out the right messages that will lead to changing their, or at least trying to influence their behaviors and their health behaviors. Another reason that I was interested in your results is because these opinion polls have some kind of overlap with an experience that we have in our department of doing national household health surveys. We're about to publish the results of the Saudi National Mental Health Survey, which we recently concluded, that interviewed Saudis all over the kingdom. It's a very, very long diagnostic psychiatric survey that diagnoses people's mental health conditions. And this showed us, the results of this is going to be published very soon in the International Journal of Methods in Psychiatric Research. And our results shows what we always thought we knew, which is Saudis are not very different from the rest of the world when it comes to mental health. Before the COVID-19 epidemic, we used to be talking about the global mental health epidemic, where the WHO declared that anxiety and depression are the top 2 illnesses in the world. So what did the numbers show in Saudi Arabia? Just like the other countries that did the same survey that we did, we found that a big proportion of the population suffers from having some mental issues. About 1 out of 3 Saudis has had a mental health problem at some point during their life. And 1 in 4 has had some kind of diagnosable mental illness at some point. Which is almost similar to the results that we found in the Netherlands and in France. They had the same numbers that we did, but we were a little bit, mental health was in Saudi Arabia was a little bit less prevalent than that was in the US. I wanted to end by saying something very important to me, and that I'm sure you all agree with, which is today they keep repeating how healthcare and doctors are the front line, people's protecting the spread of the disease, when actually it is the people who are acting as the front line towards preventing progression and mitigating the progress of this disease in the society. And that's why it's this research that you have done, the opinion polls, understanding people's opinions and sentiments about these important issues, as well as trying to understand their mental health concerns. Together, these will lead to us finding more about how people make health decisions and how they can prevent progression of the epidemic in society. So these results and such research cannot be overemphasized, especially during this period. Thank you.
So Yasmin, thank you so much. I think it's a good reminder for all of us that if we're going to get through this, it's going to take all of us to be out there and working on this. And I think that's what was so impressive about what we learned in Saudi. I'm going to call on Elliot Hoff, who runs our crisis practice at APCO, but for the last, since January, has been deeply involved in looking at the virus around the world and working with populations and companies as they've had their response. And maybe, Elliot, you can provide some comments also to Yasmin's comments about who's on the front line.
Thanks, Marjorie, and thank you all for your time today. I'm going to shift the discussion a little bit away from government and more towards business. And regarding the polling, I was actually not surprised knowing what I know about the region and about Saudi Arabia, but relative to the rest of the world, I completely agree with Marjorie and Mamoun and Chris and others. These results would absolutely not be replicated if done in other parts of the world. It's a very unique situation that you have in the country and in the region. So as Marjorie said, APCO's been on the front lines of helping our clients manage this from the beginning. Many of our clients have significant operations in China, and we ourselves have a strong presence in the market. So we've been working with clients and following the evolution of this, which taught us a lot of interesting things. The key learning is that a singular approach for businesses to respond to the crisis does not work. And I think that your poll, which was not of business but of individuals, is indicative of that. Although the issue is global due to many factors, companies and, as we were talking about, countries, while they may share the same principles of managing the COVID crisis, care for their people, business continuity, planning for the future, how they operate regarding that is very unique to their circumstances. And this has been highlighted as the virus spreads into different parts of the world, and there are peaks and valleys of this. And what we're seeing is really a bifurcated economy. There's been a significant split recently between how we're supporting clients that are considered essential businesses, such as food businesses and healthcare companies and the public sector, and what we're doing for businesses that are considered non-essential, like retail and travel and entertainment. And essential businesses, they're trying to support their employees and keep them at work. Employees who are hearing that they should be home, who are walking through the streets of their towns and their cities. And I'm in New York, sitting here now in the center of this, and I could speak from not only from the work I do, but from very personal experience of going outside in New York City. It's hard to keep people at work in these essential businesses. So companies are doing what they can to support their people with health initiatives, even things like hand washing, a lot of what we've spoken about, to help prove to them that they're in a safe environment so they can continue with their essential businesses and don't become non-essential and irrelevant. So in one sense, the people with jobs, and many people do not have jobs anymore, are lucky to have them. On the other hand, they don't feel so lucky because they're often in what are dangerous situations. Non-essential businesses see the world completely differently. First and foremost, they're working with us and internally to help secure stimulus money, which is available all over the world, including in Saudi Arabia. And they're figuring out ways to communicate around that. So if you are a retailer that is out of business, how do you communicate, basically not working, how do you communicate what you're going to do with stimulus money and how you're going to come back stronger? And they're communicating around layoffs, they're communicating around debt, around financial management and the like. The bottom line is that only time will tell how many clients will move from essential to non-essential. So I'll give you an example. Well, for now, you know, there's this anecdote that chocolate companies are doing very well because everyone's sitting home eating chocolate. When will that change? When will people really be in such a dire situation that even those semi-luxury items will become a real luxury, and those kinds of companies will move from the essential to non-essential. And what we're helping these companies do is really plan for that. So to wrap up my section here, I want to just quickly highlight the main areas of how we're working with these clients all over the world. The first is scenario planning. And for both these essential and what's considered non-essential businesses, we're doing deep scenario planning to really look at different situations of how this may play out and how they will react. We're providing a lot of client support for stimulus funds, again, and how they communicate it. And my last point, which is very critical, even now, every company we're working for is preparing for how they come back after the crisis. And we're doing significant work in what we're talking about coming back stronger, whether there will be a new normal where people will not go back to their old habits, where more people will work at home, where people will realize they don't need to dine out as much, where people will realize they don't need to purchase as many luxury goods as they were purchasing. That's one possibility. We're preparing for that. But there's a significant school of thought that people, and in the results of the survey sort of indicate this is what will happen in the region that you're in, that people are going to rush back into life, that they're going to run to the stores, they're going to run to the restaurants, that the economy is going to come back in a strong way. Smart companies are preparing for both of these possibilities and putting plans in place to come back in a stronger way. And I'm happy to take any questions now or when we are done with the other speakers.
I'm going to, Elliot, move us through this because some of the questions that are coming through I think are going to be addressed as we continue, and
Sure.
then I'll come back and direct them at the various people. And I do think that part of what we saw in the research is that some of this is so new to Saudi, the opportunity to have these restaurants and these opportunities that that is part of the momentum of going forward, where I think a lot of other people have taken these for granted and maybe it's been overdone, and this has been a chance to kind of reset priorities in a different way. So it'll be interesting just to hear what other people are thinking about. But I'd like to turn to Jim McGregor. Jim has been in China for a long time, although he's not sitting there right now. 30 years or so, Jim, I think. And I think, you know, having seen China go through this, I think we can learn a lot from what happened, and also maybe it gives us some hope that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So why don't you walk us through your observations?
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. Well, I think as we've seen in China, they may have shown the rest of the world how to close down. They closed down very tightly, and the Communist Party, having neighborhood committees, could keep a check on every citizen, basically. And now they have everybody on a phone app where they can track them and they can tell where they've been. And if it's green, you can go around because that shows you don't have the virus. Temperature checks everywhere. They close the border to foreigners now, and actually cut off a lot of, there's one flight a week from each country per airline because they're worried about a relapse and bringing in cases from the outside, which has been happening. What has been the result? Economically, this is very tough for China. They're looking at about 6 million jobs lost in manufacturing for export. They're looking at exports being down as much as 45% Q2. They've got about almost 9 million college graduates coming out. They're going to have a hard time getting jobs. So the government is having state-owned enterprise, the military, community service companies. They're pushing them to hire these people. And so China's figuring out how they're going to deal with this. They've had a big debt problem, so they're being careful on really pushing out a lot of stimulus funds. Instead, they're using these special purpose bonds on local governments for specific projects, which don't go onto the national balance sheet on debt. I'm not an economist, but it's a way to get some money out there without adding to the national debt. Politically, China is kind of stepping out after initially really bungling the response to this and therefore it becoming a global pandemic. They're trying to move ahead by helping countries. They're sending masks, they're sending doctors. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are calling world leaders every day. And they're trying to come out as somebody that's helping fix the problem around the world now and get the onus of people that started the problem, off their back. Businesses in China are assessing real time. I'm in touch with about 80 friends who run foreign companies in China, and what they're doing is they're adjusting in real time. It's splitting into a different way of looking at China, in China for China. Because the China market is so important for especially technology companies, they're doubling down on in China for China on their manufacturing. They're moving more supply chains in. Now this is before the virus, but that will continue because China is still the market. But in manufacturing for the world, you're going to see a lot of supply chains moving out of China. In fact, there was a call this week with Taiwanese manufacturers of assemblers of mobile phones and electronics, and they are saying things like they will have 50% of the production out of China by 2021. China, on the other hand, is sensing an opportunity because they are opening up as the world is closing down. Opening up means step by step in offices. They're staggering their staff. They're only letting 1/3 or 1/2 of the staff in on different days. They set apart. It's all done very carefully. But they're also moving ahead on their technology ambitions. China had this Made in China 2025 plan on artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, et cetera, before this happened. And now they're going to double down on it because they're looking at an opportunity. If they're going to spend money and they're going to try to build jobs, why not build them for the industries of the future? Shanghai, just as one example, Shanghai, probably the most ambitious city in China of 24 million. Last week, they announced 152 investment projects worth $63 billion US. Now, some of this is projects that were already underway and they're highlighting big numbers, but these are things in biomedicine, aerospace, new materials, intelligent manufacturing, such things as Tencent is partnering to build an AI supercomputing center. Shanghai's opening up 60 square kilometers of land for 26 new special industrial parks. They've already got a lot of industrial parks there. Sometimes China overdoes things, but you can see that it's a thrust forward. Let's take advantage of this and move to the next economy and not get too tied up in what we're losing in the old economy. The foreign investment law, they came out last April 1st with statements from the Ministry of Commerce on being more open to foreign business, welcoming foreign business. They've been following the letter of the US trade agreement very closely. On April 1st, they opened up on financial services, and Nomura, JP Morgan, Goldman, Morgan Stanley are increasing their investments and their ownership of their financial services there. And I think we're going to see some profound changes. I think the world will watch how China comes out of this on the longer term changes. Working from home. Companies are finding that the people don't want to go back to work because a lot of people in China have brutal hour and a half commutes. And they want to get out of their house and go to a restaurant, but they found that they can get a lot of work done at home and they don't have that long commute that's been wearing them out. So I think we're going to see more and more working from home. Remote learning. China's got an interesting thing going now because the schools have not reopened. And so if you're a school administrator or a teacher, every day you have to account for every student that you're in charge of. And you have to get their temperature and you have to download it in a document to the Education Bureau. And they're doing remote learning, and a lot of these kids, the lower income ones, they have a mobile phone, they don't have a computer. So there's a lot of kids doing homework on mobile phones. Let's see what happens with that, if that becomes some kind of a global trend. And the healthcare system, I think, in China is going to have to revamp itself, as I think America and many other parts of the world.
So Jim, just one other thing that maybe you could just give us a sentence or two about. As we're sitting here all in lockdown, I think everybody on the phone is in lockdown, whether they're in London or Saudi or US. So China is not anymore. What's it like coming out of this? How quickly did people come out of it? How safe do people feel going back to work? What does the picture look like?
It's very tentative, Marjorie. They came out fairly fast at first and opened the movie theaters, and within a day they closed them down again. The restaurants are still, the ones that are open, we're allowing one person per table. You go out to dinner with somebody and you sit at separate tables. It's very tentative. It's still temperature checks everywhere. People that opened their offices are now backing off a bit on how fast they're going to do that because of the, there's this return of, from people who have been coming back to China have been bringing the infection back. And also people do not believe the government. They're very worried that the numbers are much higher. And I mentioned it earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. Wuhan, the center of this virus, Chinese reporters were down there looking at the mortuaries. And they were watching the burial urns being shipped in every day, 500 a day to each of them. And the numbers were so far beyond what they've reported in deaths. And so there's still a lot of fear on what's really going on, but the government is pushing very hard to get everybody back to business.
Thank you. We have about at least a dozen questions, but before we get to them, Keith, some of them are looking to the future and where we go from here. So I thought we should hear from you first, and then we can go back and take the questions.
Thanks, Marjorie. In fact, what Jim's just said is a really good segue, because I think the eyes of the world on China, and both in how they've handled it and how they come out of it, you could be seeing possibly a shift in global order. And that's one of the things that I will be paying attention to. Let me just back up and say very briefly that the work of a futurist is to do basically four things: is to see what's happening, to understand what is happening, to then look at the implications of what is happening or has happened, and then to ascribe meaning to that. And if you look at those four things, see, understand, the implications, and meaning, we're too early into this process to really add any significant weight or value to what will be the implications and certainly what will be the meaning. We are still kind of in the seeing and grappling with the understanding elements of what is happening globally. And in order to do that work, what a futurist would do as you start to look to the futures, you look to frameworks. Frameworks are important because in a global context of paradox, frameworks bring about understanding. So it's not about trying to answer specific answers. It's not about trying to prescribe certain very narrow predictions around what will happen. It's just too complex to do that. There was a futurist by the name of Gibson who put it very succinctly when he said that, and paraphrasing him, the future's already happened, it's just unequally distributed. And that is a nice way to see what's happening globally, because as we have realized that what is playing out globally, dealing with the same pandemic, is very unevenly distributed. Some going into lockdown, some still coming out, etc. So the framework that I'm using that might be helpful to those on the webinar, as one try and make sense by understanding what are the implications and ultimately what will all this mean, is a very simple framework that looks at 4 dimensions. And I'm collecting data, and some of which I've even gained in listening to the other panelists, in 4 areas. And the 4 areas are very simply, what are going to be the personal implications? What will this mean for me in what I think Eliot called the new normal? And that is a good phrase to use. We are not going to go back to the world as it once was. There will be a reset, there will be a new normal. So what does that mean for me? The second dimension, if you like, or element to that would be, what does it mean for us, for we, communities? And you could even expand that to a regional community and look at it in that framework. The third would be work. What does this mean for work? And already we've had a reference to the fact that people might not want to go back to the office. It will certainly be a kickstart, and this is what we're seeing with our clients, a kickstart to remote working, something that has been spoken about for a long time, but the mindsets haven't changed to make that feasible or possible. So the third dimension is, what does this mean for work? And then lastly, globally. And that's where I came in. I'm wondering if what we have all experienced might not, when you look back at it through the eyes of history, be seen as a epic or critical point where China started to become the dominant superpower in the world, conjecture. On the world scope, I think from the Saudi perspective, I would be very concerned or be paying attention to what will happen to the oil price as a result of what we've experienced. So yeah, that's really all I've got to contribute, which isn't really very helpful in terms of the specifics of what will play out, but we're too early in the process to understand the full implications and the meaning.
Thank you very much. I'm going to group some of these questions, and I'd say, Dr. Yasmin, first the question to you was, do you see correlations between the public health reaction to MERS and to this? And also, what are some of the future initiatives you're looking at in terms of research? What do you see might happen ahead, and how are you planning for that?
Thank you. So MERS was an epidemic that we experienced in Saudi Arabia. However, it was a very different type of epidemic because it required camel interacting or coming in contact with camels, which, despite the stereotype, very few Saudis come in contact with camels. So it hasn't been a very widespread epidemic. However, and also, by the way, the total MERS cases infected between 2012 to 2020 is only 2,500 or something like that. So you can see the magnitude of the two epidemics or the pandemics are very, very wide. However, the correlation, if you want, we could say, is that MERS helped prepare our hospitals and our health system for the COVID-19. So when we had the MERS epidemic, we developed very good preparedness policies and protocols and procedures so that when COVID-19 came, our hospitals were ready immediately, quickly, and the community was somewhat prepared. Sort of similar to how the Asian countries were prepared because they had the SARS epidemic. and that made them also prepared for the COVID-19. So that's regarding to the correlation. And the other question was about the future initiatives. So one of the slides I think that I was really happy with is that the people thought, from your opinion research results, the people thought we should invest more in research, which was music to my ears. And we're planning on doing that. There's a lot of institutions in Saudi Arabia who've released grants, research grants, inviting researchers to submit proposals for COVID-19 research projects. For us, the first thing we're going to do is, like I said, there's a lot of people handling the infectious side of the project, of the epidemic. I'm interested in the mental health aspect because I believe it's a very important thing, understanding how people, how these epidemics influence our mental health. And so we're starting a survey next week, a national survey, sort of like a sample that we already have that exists nationally, and we're going to be using a mental health instrument to compare baseline anxiety and depression 2 years ago with current anxiety and depression in the middle of the epidemic. So that's what we're going to be.
So one other quick question you had is, do you believe the lockdown will be lifted in 2 weeks, as you said? Do you have any inside information on that?
We don't have any inside information. However, I mean, given that the infected right now is not increasing dramatically. The number of people who are dying is not very high. We only have 38 dead. We hope that the flattening of the curve is happening. And so it all depends on what happens in the next 2 weeks. I think the decisions are being made on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Jim, there was a question also having to do with whether you think the situation is going to cause the Chinese to supercharge the Belt and Road Initiative and their activities in Africa.
Marjorie, they were cleaning up the Belt and Road Initiative because when it first came out, it was just, there was no central authority. People were running around doing all kinds of deals, and China found itself in some fairly bad situations economically, on a lot of money out to countries that probably couldn't pay it back. So I think, yeah, I think it'll be part of China's global outreach, but I think it's going to be more disciplined and more targeted. And I don't know how to answer on Africa because they seem to be pulling back more towards their neighborhood, towards Asia and Southeast Asia and North Asia and their neighbors to the west, because that's where it was actually, that is what the Belt and Road was all about at the beginning, and then it just went all over the world. So I can't really answer on Africa where they're going to go.
Thank you. Elliot, I'm going to come to you in a minute because the question for you was, can you name a couple of, well, that was 3 top global brands that you think have answered this perfectly, or that have responded perfectly. So I'll give you a minute to think about that while I go to Mamoun, because there were a couple questions, Mamoun, about what you think the impact is going to be on Ramadan, and whether you think that there was a reference to the Hajj and the postponement of the changes that were made, whether there needs to be better communication with Muslims abroad about how these decisions got taken and what the impact is, because there's been some, obvious comments about that.
I think Ramadan is quite soon, and I have a feeling it will be heavily impacted. You need to know that in the West, Ramadan is like Christmas, but for a whole month. For us in this region, especially in terms of consumer spending. People go completely out of kilter and they buy everything in Ramadan, and that's where most of the offers go online, including selling cars and not only food, which is the #1 item. So we have retailers who are clients who are bracing themselves for a tough Ramadan. So we believe Ramadan if some of the pressure is not lifted in terms of movement, it will have, in my view, a meaningful impact on the retail industry and in spending in general. Now, on the issue of, and maybe that's why there is so much restrictions now. I mean, we are in complete lockdown in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and I think in Bahrain and a few other countries. So I think maybe the intention is to find a way to release the pressure in Ramadan, but that is me holding a crystal ball. When it comes to Hajj, I think it's a major thing. Hajj is the most important event for any Muslim's life. And if Saudi Arabia is to decide and not to have it this year, which is going to be the first time in 1,400 years, the communication needs to be much more systematic and structured, and we need to bring collective approval and support from the Muslim world around it.
Elliot, to you about brands. You're on mute, Elliot.
Hi. So I actually think it's a bit of a trick question. And the reason I think it's a bit of a trick question is because how brands are acting externally and internally are sometimes aligned and sometimes not aligned. I think generally the brands that are handling this the best are those that had a significant purpose before the crisis, and they are leaning into that purpose and living that purpose. I will give you an example of some clients we work with. We work with Mars, the candy and pet food company. The way they are talking about this internally is completely responsible. They have several 100,000 employees and are really living their purpose and their values. I think from an external perspective, it's more difficult to assess because the business is so global. Some of the education companies that have really been supportive of online learning have stepped up to the plate, and those include technology companies that you wouldn't think of education companies, but now they are, including Microsoft and Google. So while one could say Zoom is doing well, they have their privacy problems, but Microsoft and Google are doing a phenomenal job helping children around the world learn electronically. So that's another sector. And an interesting sector to look at is the food delivery business. And this idea that you could either pick up your food or even in some cases have the food delivered without human hands really touching the food. So either the delivery people wear gloves, the food itself is only touched by certain instruments, and they've created this whole infrastructure of a way to get people food and really helping economies around the world keep going by this sort of no-touch way of doing it, which is another sort of sector that has stepped up to the plate out of necessity. One could also look based on how much money companies are pouring into this from a sort of CSR perspective. I don't think that's necessarily a fair way to look at things because companies can only give money if they have the money. And if they're one of these non-essential businesses, then the expectation that they're going to take their money and pour it into social good versus their own people is a bit challenging to get around. So there are definitely sectors that are stepping up. Healthcare, and I think Yasmin would maybe agree with me, is really trying to focus on vaccine and a cure, whether they're doing that for their own needs or the needs of society. It's probably a bit of both. So it's a tough question to answer because what we see externally is not always what's happening internally.
So I see that we're at the hour, and there's a lot more questions. And Keith, maybe you can give us just one look into the future of one thing to be looking for. But before you do that, there have been a lot of questions that have just come up about communication around the virus. How do you communicate well? What kinds of things should communicators know? How do we, what have we learned from this? What are we planning to do as experts in the field and so forth? I think that maybe there's no simple way to address these questions in 5 minutes. So maybe what we can offer to do is a second session and just focus on communications during this time. And if people are interested in that, we can invite them back to do that and have a much more robust discussion as kind of phase 2 of this process, because we didn't get to those questions today. So, so with that, Keith, maybe we'll give you the last word and thank everybody, Elliot, Chris, Jim, Yasmin, Namun, and our team for putting this together. So do you have a last word for us?
Audrey, the last word I have is, the work I do as a futurist in the leadership domain has thrown up a wonderful phrase that talks about leaders being brokers of hope. And I think it's a very powerful message right now. And hope for me is not the conviction that something will turn out well, because again, as a futurist, I'm not a crystal ball gazer. I don't know how things are going to turn out. But hope is not the conviction that things will turn out well, but rather the certainty that something makes sense regardless of the outcome. And I think that's the kind of message. And I loved what Jasmine said earlier about the front line to this is not the heroes who are actually serving on the front line in that sense, but we are the front line, the people. And maybe if I was to leave anything with those who have been part of this webinar is that how do I become a broker of hope, regardless of the outcome, because I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but that what I do now today makes sense. And so that, I guess, would be my closing thought.
Well, I love leaving this on the message of hope. And so thank you all for being with us. And again, we'll post the entire webinar and send you a link and send you the slides as well. So thank you all for being with us.